The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Francis Scott Fitzgerald.
Chapter 8. The Subjectivity of Matter.
Let us begin with the fact that in 2006, two British mathematicians, John Conway, creator of the famous game Life, and Simon Kochen, proved the so-called free will theorem. This theorem asserts that if a human, an observer, possesses free will, then an observed elementary particle must also possess free will. The proof of this theorem was strengthened twice, in 2009 and 2017, by successively relaxing the requirements of the original axiomatic framework. The free will theorem of elementary particles forced official physics to search for at least some explanation. The challenge was taken up by Sabine Hossenfelder, a German theoretical physicist known as an expert in quantum gravity. To explain this paradox within the framework of the paradigm of the Great Graveyard, she was compelled to conclude that free will does not exist at all. She claims that we possess only free choice, while free will, when something quite different, is not destined for us to have. From my point of view, however, the Conway-Kochen theorem stands as a direct, uncompromising proof that elementary particles are definitely subjective. And within the paradigm of the great life, we can prove this theorem with full clarity, that is, without any mathematics. We recall that the most primitive model of the universe must reduce to the simplest unary operator of mathematical logic, identity, and that this operator is expressed in the statement, "The universe is simply everything that is not me." In other words, this means that for such a subjective entity there is no need to recognize various phenomena of the universe as beneficial or harmful, as discussed in the chapter The Hierarchical Nature of Life, because such a subjective entity lives perfectly comfortably and safely even without those knowledge representations. Therefore, such a subjective entity does not respond to, neither wishes to, nor is capable of responding to any signals, changes, upheavals, or cataclysms of the universe, and thus must never interact with anything at all. Ideally, the particles of dark matter could claim the title of the simplest subjects of reality. Admittedly, modern physics currently lacks any experimental proof of this hypothetical substance, but that may be for one of two reasons. First, either dark matter is in principle impossible to detect, and precisely because it, being the simplest subject of reality, simply cannot interact with anything, neither with matter nor with standard fields. Second, or dark matter does not exist at all, i.e., dark matter is just a groundless theory of Swiss astronomer Fritz Zwicky. In that case, the main candidate for the title of the simplest subject of reality would most likely be the neutrino. A neutrino is a structureless elementary particle that hardly interacts with matter and only extremely weakly with standard fields. For a neutrino, nearly all types of stars are transparent and, as has been calculated, it can pass through a solid thickness of water about 100 light-years without interacting with a single encountered atom. However, a neutrino, although indirectly, does still interact with standard fields, including the electromagnetic field, as well as the so-called strong and weak nuclear fields, which allows a neutrino to exert some influence upon individual elementary particles. In other words, a neutrino in principle could know about the universe just a little more than the universe is everything that is not me, but no matter, this particle is already extraordinarily stable, that is, quite successfully maintaining its homeostasis over many billions of years. But let us return to the simplest subject of reality. Whether it is dark matter or the neutrino, no particular significance lies in choosing one. The main point is that following the logic of our paradigm of the great life, we unexpectedly arrive at the dazzling conclusion that life does not begin from the simplest cell, not from proteins, and not even from organic chemistry. It turns out life must begin from the very, very simplest elementary particle. That single conclusion alone can leave us speechless, but that is not all. From it directly follows that all the elements of matter that lie between that simplest subject of reality and the organic molecular polymers known to us from the chapter Death and the Emergence of Life must themselves be subjective. In other words, nucleons, atoms, inorganic molecules and crystals must also be subjective.
Wow.
Thus we finally arrive at the conclusion that all the known and yet unknown elements of matter must possess subjectivity.
There is no living and non-living matter. Simply all matter possesses subjectivity.
This conclusion is staggering.
How can that be? Well, it just can't be. An atom cannot be living.
To this I would ask readers to exhale, calm down, close your eyes, count mentally to 10 and think about why you, the reader, are convinced that, say, that very atom is not alive. On what basis is this conviction founded? What are you actually relying on? I myself, of course, asked that question, and I came to the conclusion that I have at my disposal as many as 123 mutually inconsistent definitions of life, which were discussed at the beginning of the book. Yet at the same time, we have not a single scientific definition of non-life, not one. It follows that if we want to classify something as non-living, we simply must ensure that for that thing, none of the 123 definitions from Eduard Trifonov's list apply, because it is assumed that non-life is simply the everything else. As you remember, in our childhood, non-living was everything that firstly doesn't run, secondly doesn't eat. It turns out that what the paradigm of the Great Graveyard offers us is simply an expansion of our childhood list to 123 entries. And here, of course, the reader will remind me of the question about the stone, which I promised to answer in the chapter Spontaneous Improvement. Can a stone be considered a subjective entity? The answer is simple. A stone by itself is not a subjective entity, but represents an unorganized colony of subjective entities of a lower hierarchy level. Molecules? Molecules, as we have just learned, are quite proto-alive. That is to say, at the molecular level, the stone is still proto-alive. Only at this level of the hierarchy of life, we do not see or feel it. In the case of the stone, life, no matter how hard it tries, cannot unite those disparate molecules into some organism, that is, cannot find a way out to a higher hierarchical level. Therefore, the stone is left only chemically to degrade. Many things we call inanimate objects only because at our level of the life hierarchy they degrade. In reality,
any non-living object is simply an unorganized colony of subjective entities of a lower level in the hierarchy of life.
And now I will present to you the worldview that I sketched after many years of reflection on this topic. In my view, the hierarchy for the planetary branch of life builds level by level approximately as follows. A higher level of the life hierarchy relative to dark matter and neutrinos is... Here I clearly lack specialized knowledge to single out the class of proto-living entities which form the hierarchical level of life that stands on the shoulders of neutrinos. But that does not really matter. What matters is merely to understand that such a hierarchical level exists and may exist several levels above. In any case, moving upward, we definitely arrive at the level of nucleons, neutrons and protons. From nucleons, atomic nuclei form. This obviously is yet another hierarchical level of life, the level of atoms. In the periodic table at present, there are 113 chemical elements. In essence, these are 113 forks, 113 startups launched by life into operation. Some uniform atoms have a tendency to spontaneously unite into crystals. This is a new, wildly interesting hierarchical level of life, which played a huge role in humanity's technical revolution. It is precisely by riding the crystalline level that we managed to create transistors and then microelectronics, which gave rise to computers, thanks to which humanity now reaps the fruits of the information revolution and strides in great leaps toward the era of artificial intelligence. And yet humans still mostly do not realize that essentially they tamed and put to work the crystalline subjectivity of silicon, just as many thousands of years ago they tamed and put to work, say, horses. Different types of atoms have a tendency to spontaneously unite, to enter into chemical reactions and bonds. This, along with crystals, is the second fork above the atomic level, the level of molecules. Molecules, being formations of different types of atoms, adapt a very broad set of behavioral schemes studied by the science of chemistry. But among the 113 types of atoms participating in the formation of the molecular level under earthly conditions, the commonly recognized champion atom is, of course, carbon. For this proto-living entity, the model of the universe turned out most promising. It allows the formation of an infinite number of stable molecular compounds of varying complexity and spatial structure. Hence, above the carbon atom, a whole huge branch of the life hierarchy bloomed, starting with the level of organic chemistry. And further upward along this organic branch, on the shoulders of organic chemistry, appeared the level of amino acids and proteins, on the shoulders of which in time appeared the level of cells, on the shoulders of which the level of organisms, on the shoulders of which, accordingly, the level of quasi-organisms, on the shoulders of which, but we'll talk about that level later in the next section of the book.
Summary.
There is no living and non-living matter. Simply, all matter possesses subjectivity. Every so-called non-living object, in reality, is simply an unorganized colony of subjective entities of a lower level in the hierarchy of life. All elementary particles are proto-living entities. The simplest subjective entity is likely either dark matter or the neutrino.